My name is Renee Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and for 3 years my mother lived in my basement, ate at my table, and called me the daughter who saved her life. Then, in front of 11 relatives she hadn't spoken to in a decade, she told them I threw her out. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I set down my wine glass, excused myself, to the bathroom, and opened my banking app. 41 months of transfers. Rent she never paid. Medication she never covered. A car payment with my name on the loan and her name on the title. I didn't say a word that night. I just started forwarding PDFs to my own email, one at a time, quietly, the way you'd back up a hard drive before a house fire. 2 weeks later, my mother was sitting in my sister's guest room, telling everyone how good it felt to finally be somewhere she was wanted. And that's when I sent the group text that ended it. Welcome back to Stories, where quiet women tell you exactly how they took their lives back. No shouting, no chaos, just the truth told slowly. If stories about family, boundaries, and the cost of being the reliable one speak to you, drop a comment below and subscribe. This one has receipts, and I mean that literally. I need to back up, because you should understand what 3 years actually looks like before I tell you how it ended. I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my working life finding the one transaction that doesn't belong, the invoice that's been altered, the account that's been drained a little at a time so nobody notices until the totals stop adding up. Companies hire me when they suspect someone inside is lying to them with numbers. I'm good at it because I don't get emotional about a ledger. A ledger either balances or it doesn't. There's no version of a spreadsheet that hurts your feelings if you read it correctly. I live in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet subdivision outside Millbrook, the kind of street where the lawns are mowed on Saturdays and everyone waves from their cars. I bought it 8 years ago, alone, after a divorce that taught me the value of owning something outright. The basement is finished, full bathroom, small kitchenette, a window well that actually lets in light. My ex-husband and I built it out years ago thinking we'd rent it eventually, or maybe use it for a home office. Instead, it became my mother's home for 3 years, and I never once asked her for $1 of rent because that's not how I was raised to treat family. My mother is Diane Callahan. She's 64. She married my stepfather, Roger, when I was 19, and for the better part of 2 decades, that marriage looked, from the outside, like the good kind. A lake house on weekends, a used Cadillac every 4 years, Christmas cards with a photo of the two of them on a cruise ship somewhere warm. What none of us knew, because Roger managed every account, and my mother had never once looked at a statement in her adult life, was that Roger had been quietly liquidating their retirement funds for almost a decade to cover a gambling habit that finally caught up with all three of them the year he had his heart attack in a casino parking lot in Atlantic City. My mother came out of that marriage with $11,000, a car that needed brakes, and a stack of unopened envelopes from creditors she didn't understand. She was 61 years old and had never filed her own taxes. I have a brother, Patrick, 41, who lives 3 states away and calls on birthdays if his wife reminds him. And I have a younger sister, Michelle, 34, who lives 20 minutes from my mother's old house and had, up until the year I'm telling you about, not spoken to her, or to most of the extended family, in almost 9 years over a falling out involving Michelle's ex-husband, a wedding that got canceled, and accusations that had never fully been resolved, only left to calcify into a silence everyone tiptoed around. So when Roger's mess came apart, and my mother needed somewhere to live, there was really only one phone that rang, and it was mine. I want to be honest about something, because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was a saint about it. I didn't take my mother in purely out of love. I took her in because I am, and have always been, the fixer, the one who reads the fine print, the one who, at 22, sat across from a hospital billing department and negotiated my grandmother's final invoice down by $6,000 because nobody else in the family could stand to look at the paperwork. Being useful was never a burden to me the way it is to some people. It was, for most of my life, the only currency I trusted completely because, unlike love, usefulness could be measured, and I have always needed to be able to measure a thing to believe it was real. So when my mother called me crying from a Motel 6 outside Harrisburg, I didn't hesitate. I drove 3 hours that Saturday, packed what was left of her belongings into my SUV, and brought her home to the room in my basement that I'd been meaning to turn into a home gym. The first year was, if I'm honest, good. She cooked dinner most nights. She's a genuinely wonderful cook, the kind who can make a Tuesday feel like a holiday with nothing but a roasted chicken and good bread. And for the first time since my divorce, I came home to a lit kitchen instead of an empty one. I helped her untangle Roger's financial wreckage. I sat with her at my dining room table 3 nights a week for 4 months, teaching her, slowly, patiently, how to read a bank statement, how to build a budget, how a credit score works. I found her a part-time job at a fabric store because she mentioned once, almost shyly, that she used to sew before she married my stepfather, and I remembered that about her before she'd fully remembered it herself. I paid for her medications, which were not cheap. She has a heart condition that requires 3 prescriptions a month, and without insurance for the first 8 months, that came out of my account quietly on the 15th of every month, the same day as my mortgage. I drove her to every cardiology appointment for a year until she qualified for Medicare. When her old Cadillac finally died in my driveway, I co-signed a loan on a modest used Honda because her credit, thanks to Roger, was in ruins, and put the title in both our names because the bank required a co-owner with income. None of this was ever framed by me as a transaction. I never once sat my mother down and itemized what I was doing for her. I genuinely believed, and this matters for what comes later, that I was simply being a daughter, that love in my family had always looked like showing up with your checkbook and your car keys and asking questions later. What I did, because it is simply how my mind works, is keep records. Every transfer went into a spreadsheet I titled, with more optimism than I realized at the time, Mom, temporary. I didn't do this because I distrusted her. I did it because I distrust nothing more than an unexamined number, and a lifetime in forensic accounting had trained that instinct into me the way other people are trained to lock their front door without thinking about it. By the second year, something had started to shift, though it took me a long time to name it. My mother stopped mentioning rent, which was fine. I'd never charged her any. But she also stopped mentioning gratitude in the small ways she used to. The thank yous got shorter. The dinners got less frequent. She started referring to the basement in conversations with her sister on the phone that I overheard from the kitchen above as my apartment, in a tone that suggested ownership rather than shelter. And she started calling Michelle. I didn't think much of it at first. Michelle and my mother reconciling felt, on the surface, like something to celebrate. 9 years is a long time for a family to hold a grudge, and I had always privately hoped the two of them would find their way back to each other. What I didn't understand yet was the shape that reconciliation was taking, or the currency it was being purchased with. The calls got longer. Sunday afternoons, then Tuesday evenings, then almost daily, my mother disappearing into the basement with the door closed, her voice a low murmur through the floor vents that I couldn't make out, and if I'm honest, didn't try very hard to. I was glad she had something. A person needs somewhere to put their loneliness that isn't the daughter paying her medical bills. It was March of the third year when my mother mentioned, almost in passing while doing dishes, that Michelle had invited the whole extended family, the aunts, the cousins, the second cousins nobody quite remembers the connection to a reunion at a rented lake pavilion in June. It'll be nice, my mother said, not quite looking at me, for everyone to see how well I'm doing. I remember thinking that was a strange way to phrase it. How well I'm doing, not how well we're doing. Not a mention, even in passing, of the basement, the spreadsheet, the 3 years of 15th of the month transfers that had, by that point, quietly become a number I hadn't let myself add up in full. I should have added it up sooner, but you don't audit your own mother. You just keep paying, and you keep believing the story you've told yourself about why. The reunion was held on the second Saturday in June at a lakeside pavilion an hour outside Millbrook that Michelle had booked, and I would later learn that my mother had quietly paid half of, with money I'd given her the week before for a dental thing that, as far as I can tell, never happened. I want to walk you through that day carefully, because every detail of it matters later. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a sheet cake I'd ordered from the good bakery on Main Street, the kind with real buttercream, because that's what you do when you show up to family things. You bring something, you smile, you make yourself useful before anyone has to ask. My mother was already there, seated at the head of a long picnic table under strings of lights someone had hung between two oaks, wearing a yellow sundress I didn't recognize, and holding court in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. Not since before Roger. Not since before any of it. Aunt Carol was there and her husband Frank. Two cousins I hadn't seen since a funeral in 2019. Michelle's ex-mother-in-law, oddly, who had apparently stayed close to Michelle even through the divorce. And Patrick, who'd flown in for the weekend and was already 3 beers into an afternoon he clearly intended to enjoy without complication. For the first 2 hours it was, genuinely, a pleasant day. My mother laughed with Aunt Carol about something from decades ago. My niece Josie chased the cousins' kids around the grass with a water gun. I sat at the edge of the table, the way I usually do at these things, half in the conversation and half doing the quiet accounting I always do at family gatherings. Who's drinking too much, whose marriage looks strained, who needs a ride home. It was around 5, after the burgers and before the cake I'd brought, that Aunt Carol turned to my mother and asked, warmly, innocently, the question that started everything. "So where are you staying now, Diane? Michelle mentioned you finally got settled somewhere good." My mother didn't even glance at me. That's the detail I keep returning to. She didn't hesitate, didn't flush, didn't do any of the small tells I'd have expected from a woman about to say something untrue in front of her own daughter. She simply set down her fork, folded her hands, the way she does when she's about to deliver something she's rehearsed, and said, "Oh, it was rough there for a while. I stayed with Renee for a bit after Roger, but that didn't really work out. Renee's got her own life, her own schedule." I'd understood. "I found a lovely little place through a friend from church. Small, but it's mine." I sat very still. A lovely little place through a friend from church. My mother had not left my basement. My mother was, at that exact moment, going to be sleeping in my basement that night in the bed I had bought her under a roof I had refinanced for the sole purpose of finishing that basement into a place a person could live with dignity. Aunt Carol made a sympathetic sound. "Well, these things happen. Family's complicated. I'm just glad you landed on your feet, honey." "I had to," my mother said, and here is the sentence that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, delivered lightly, almost cheerfully, over a paper plate of potato salad. Nobody else was going to catch me. Nobody else was going to catch me. I did not correct her. I want to be very clear about that, because everything that came after depended on that single choice. I did not stand up, did not say that's not true, did not do the thing that every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do, which was to recite from memory the exact dollar amount currently sitting in the checking account I had co-signed for her, or the pharmacy the 4 blocks from my house that filled her prescriptions every month, or the fact that she had 3 days earlier asked me to pick up more of the good coffee she likes because she'd run out. I have spent my career learning that the person who reacts first in a room full of incomplete information is always the person who loses the argument. So I smiled, the way you smile at a client you already know is lying to you, and I said, "I'm glad you're settled, Mum," and I reached for a napkin, and I let the conversation move on to something else. It was Michelle who did the damage that actually mattered. About 40 minutes later, out by the drink cooler, refilling a bowl of ice, my sister, the sister I hadn't had a real conversation with in almost a decade until 3 months earlier, leaned toward me with the particular brightness of someone who thinks she's being kind, and said, "I'm really glad you're not being weird about today. Mum told me everything that happened. I know it wasn't easy, having her there and then having to ask her to go. I just want you to know I don't think less of you for it." I looked at my sister for what felt like a very long time. "Ask her to go," I repeated. "I know it's hard," Michelle said, already misreading my tone as guilt rather than genuine confusion, patting my arm with the ice scoop still in her hand. "You did what you had to do. Nobody's judging you. I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to sit with it, standing next to a cooler of beer at my mother's 9th-year family reunion. Nobody's judging you. As if there were something to be judged for. As if I had done something that required forgiveness, rather than 3 years of 15th of the month transfers that I could, at that exact moment, have pulled up on my phone in under 9 seconds. I didn't pull up my phone. Not yet. I finished refilling the ice, said something non-committal about family being complicated, and went back to the table, and I ate my slice of the cake I had bought, and I laughed at Patrick's story about his flight delay, and I drove my mother home that night in near silence, both of us pretending the day had gone exactly the way it looked like it had gone. But that night, after I heard her basement door close and the television flick on down there, the way it always did, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and I did the thing I do better than almost anyone I know. I opened my banking portal, and I started exporting statements. 41 months. Rent she never paid because I never charged it, but the mortgage on that basement's finish out had a number, and I found it. Every pharmacy transaction. The car loan, still in both our names, 11 payments of which had come entirely from my account with zero contribution from hers. The $400 I'd given her the week before the reunion for a dental appointment I now had strong reason to believe had gone toward half a pavilion rental. I didn't cry. That's the part people expect and the part that never actually happened. What I felt, sitting at that table at 11 at night with a spreadsheet slowly filling with 3 years of my own quiet, unthanked competence, was something colder and clearer than grief. It was the exact feeling I get at work when I find a transaction that doesn't belong. Not rage, not yet, just a very calm, very focused certainty that I was finally looking at the truth, and that the truth, once fully assembled, does not need me to raise my voice for anyone to hear it. At 11:47 that night, I found the group text. It wasn't hidden exactly. My mother had, at some point, added me to a family thread months earlier for logistics about the reunion, then apparently forgot I was in it because the thread had splintered into a second one without me, and a screenshot of that second thread had been sent to me, unprompted, an hour earlier by my cousin Denise, who'd added the caption, "Thought you should see this, none of my business, but it seemed wrong not to say something." I opened it standing in my kitchen with the lights off. The thread was titled, in my mother's phone, simply, "Us." I scrolled up through 3 months of messages. My mother, coaching Michelle and Patrick on what to say if I ever brought up the money stuff at the reunion. Just tell her family isn't a business. She'll back down. She always does when someone calls her cold. Michelle, asking if it was really true that I'd kicked her out, and my mother's answer, time-stamped a full 6 weeks before the reunion. Not exactly, but let's just say it that way. It's simpler, and Renee will never correct me in front of everyone. You know how she is. She'd rather look calm than look right. She'd rather look calm than look right. I read that sentence maybe 10 times, standing in my dark kitchen with my mother's television murmuring faintly through the floor, beneath my feet, and somewhere around the 6th reading, the heart did the same thing it always does in my line of work when a suspicion finally becomes a documented fact. It turned professional. "All right, Mom," I remember thinking, with a stillness that frightened me a little more than the anger would have. "Let's see exactly how calm I can be." I closed the laptop. I did not go downstairs. I did not confront her that night, or the next morning, or for the 11 days that followed, during which my mother continued to sleep in my basement, eat food I'd paid for, and, as I would later learn, tell at least 4 more relatives some version of the story in which she was the one who'd been turned away. I simply started building the file. I want to tell you what those 11 days actually looked like from the inside, because from the outside, nothing about my life changed at all. I went to work. I closed out a fraud case for a mid-sized manufacturing client that had taken me 4 months to untangle, a warehouse manager skimming inventory receipts, a skein so quietly built that it took me 3 separate audits to see the shape of it, which felt, given everything else happening in my life that week, almost darkly funny. I came home every evening to the same lit kitchen window, the same basement television murmuring through the floor vents, the same mother who greeted me with the same warmth she always had, as if a family reunion 41 miles away hadn't happened, as if a group text titled Us didn't exist on a phone in her purse. That's the part I need you to sit with, because it's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it. My mother was not cold to me during those 11 days. She was, if anything, sweeter than usual. She made a pot roast on the Tuesday after the reunion, my stepfather's old recipe, and set a place for me at the table with the good napkins, and asked about my day the way she always did, and I sat there eating dinner across from a woman who had, 6 weeks earlier, and in writing, told my sister it was simpler to say I'd thrown her out. I did not confront her at that table. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't kindness, not entirely. It was strategy, the same instinct that has served me well for 15 years in my actual job. You do not show your hand to a subject before you've finished the audit. You gather everything first. You confirm every figure twice. You make certain that when you finally lay the file on the table, there is no gap in it wide enough for someone to slip a denial through. So during those 11 days, I built the file. I pulled 3 years of bank statements and organized them by category: rent equivalent, medical, transportation, groceries, miscellaneous, the same way I'd organize evidence for a client's board of directors. I requested a payoff statement on the Honda loan, which still had $11,000 remaining, entirely in my name for payment purposes, even though the title listed us both. I pulled the pharmacy records, going back to the first month, because I wanted more than anything else an exact number, the total. When I finished on the 9th night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold beside me, was $71,340. 3 years, 1 month, 4 days. Rent she never paid on space that had cost me $22,000 to finish. Medications. The car. Groceries I'd never once itemized separately because who itemizes groceries for their own mother? 2 dental procedures, the real ones before the fictional one at the reunion. A hearing aid the year before when her insurance wouldn't cover the higher-end model, and she'd cried at the audiologist's office, and I'd paid the difference without a second thought, because that is, apparently, what daughters who'd rather look calm than look right do. $71,340 and a sentence in a group text calling me cold. I did not send anything to anyone during those 11 days. On the 10th day, the ground shifted. I came home from work to find my mother's bedroom, the basement bedroom, half packed. Not all the way, but enough that I stood at the bottom of the stairs holding my laptop bag and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way it does right before I present a finding I already know is going to upset someone. Michelle offered me her guest room, my mother said, not quite meeting my eyes, folding a cardigan into an open suitcase on the bed I had bought her. Just until I get properly settled somewhere. It'll be good for us. Spending more time together. We've missed a lot of years. I want to be clear that nothing about a grown woman choosing to live somewhere else is, on its face, a betrayal. What made my chest go still was not the move. It was the sentence that followed it, delivered lightly, almost as an afterthought, while she zipped the suitcase closed. I told Michelle I'd finally be somewhere I'm actually wanted. My mother said, "No offense, honey. You've just always made it feel like an obligation. You know." Michelle says I light up when I talk about coming to stay with her. I think that says something. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the room I had built with my own money for a woman who had just told me, to my face, that 3 years of 15th of the month transfers, of driven-to-ever cardiology appointment devotion, of co-signed loans and unasked for dental bills, had felt to her like an obligation rather than love, and that the daughter who had done none of it, who had in fact vanished for 9 years and reappeared only months earlier, was the one who made her feel wanted. I did not say any of the 71,000 things I could have said. I said, I hope it's good for you both, and I went upstairs, and I made myself dinner, and I listened to my mother's suitcase wheels bump up the basement stairs an hour later, and I did not offer to help her carry anything, and she did not ask. She left the next morning while I was at work. She left me a note on the kitchen counter, in the same round, cheerful handwriting I remembered from childhood report cards and birthday cards, and it said, "Thank you for everything, sweetie. Don't be a stranger. Mom, don't be a stranger." 3 years, $71,000, and I got a post-it note that addressed me the way you address a waitress. I stood in my kitchen holding that note for a long time. Then I did something that surprised even me. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I walked down to the basement, which was, for the first time in 3 years, completely empty. Stripped bed, bare dresser, the faint rectangular outline in the carpet where her armchair had sat, and I opened the window well to let in some air, and I stood there in the quiet for a while, the way you stand at the edge of a room after a coat has finally stopped, when the alarms go silent and you're left with nothing but the residue of everything you just held together. Then I went back upstairs, and I opened my laptop, and I finished the file. I gave it 4 more days, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the timing to be right, and because a part of me, the part that had spent 3 years believing usefulness was the same thing as love, needed those 4 days to fully accept what the group text and the suitcase and the note had already told me in plain language, that my mother had rewritten 3 years of my life into a story where I was the villain, and that she had done it not out of confusion or misunderstanding, but with full, documented intent. During those 4 days the story continued to spread exactly as she had apparently planned it would. Aunt Carol called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice gentle in the particular way people's voices get when they think they are being diplomatic about something that isn't actually their business. "Your mother's doing so much better now," she said. "I just want you to know, whatever happened between you two, nobody's holding it against you. Families go through seasons." I'd asked, carefully, what exactly she'd heard, just that things got difficult. Aunt Carol said, her tone shifting slightly, that you two had some conflict about her staying with you, and it didn't work out, and she needed somewhere else to go. "Michelle's been wonderful, taking her in like that." I thanked Aunt Carol for calling, and I told her, gently, that I hoped she'd keep an open mind, and I hung up and I added her name to a list I'd started keeping, not out of spite, but because I have learned in my line of work that when you finally present a finding, you need to know exactly who has already been told the false version, so you know exactly who needs to see the true one. By the end of that week, I had heard some version of the story from 4 separate relatives, each one delivered with the same careful, apologetic gentleness, each one absolutely certain of a version of events that had never happened. On the 15th day since the reunion, I sat down at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening with my laptop, a mug of chamomile tea, and the finished file, a clean, chronological PDF, 41 pages, every transfer dated and categorized, every pharmacy receipt scanned, the Honda loan statement with my name on every single payment, the total in bold at the bottom of the final page, $71,340.16. I did not send it to my mother first. I sent it with a short, calm cover message to the family group chat. The real one, the one my mother had apparently forgotten, still included me. The message read, "Hi everyone. I understand there's been some confusion about what happened between Mom and me over the last few years, so I wanted to share the actual record in case it's helpful. Attached is a summary of the financial support I provided while she lived with me. 3 years, 1 month. I'm not sharing this to embarrass anyone or ask for anything back. I just don't think it's fair for a version of events that isn't true to keep circulating without the facts attached to it. I love my mother. I hope she's happy with Michelle. I just needed the truth on the record." Renee, I attached the PDF. I hit send at 8:04 on a Sunday evening, and then I put my phone face down on the table, and I finished my tea, and I did not pick it back up for almost 40 minutes. When I finally turned the phone back over, there were 31 messages. Patrick first, blunt as always. "Holy shit, Renee." Then Aunt Carol, her tone entirely different. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry I said anything to you on the phone. This is not what I was told at all. A cousin I barely spoke to. Wait, so she was never kicked out? She was living with you rent-free this whole time?" And then, 22 minutes after my message, my mother's response. Not to me, not privately, but to the whole thread, visible to everyone, time-stamped and permanent the same way everything else in that file now was. "I can't believe you would do this to me. Airing our private business to the whole family like this. This is exactly the kind of cold, calculated thing I've had to deal with my whole life from you. You've never once let anything go without turning it into a spreadsheet." I read that message 3 times sitting at my kitchen table, and something in me, some last, small, hopeful thing I hadn't fully let go of, finally quietly closed. She hadn't denied a single number. Not one. I typed one more message. "I'm not asking anyone to choose a side. I'm just done being the version of me that lets a lie stand because correcting it might make someone uncomfortable. The numbers are real. I have every receipt if anyone wants to see them individually. I hope you're happy at Michelle's, Mom. I mean that. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done being invisible in my own story. I set the phone down, and this time I didn't pick it back up at all that night. I went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in over 2 weeks, and I slept. The week after I sent that file, my phone did not stop. Not with more accusations, but with a different kind of message entirely. The kind that arrives after a story has collapsed, and the people who repeated it need somewhere to put their embarrassment. And Carol sent a long, apologetic text on Monday morning that ended with, "I should have asked you directly instead of just believing what I was told. I'm sorry, honey." A cousin I hadn't heard from in years sent a single line. "Your mom used to tell us you were the difficult one." I feel like an idiot. I answered all of them the same way, politely, briefly. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." Michelle called me on Wednesday. "I didn't know," Michelle said, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Renee, I swear to God I didn't know any of that. She told me you'd basically told her to figure it out on her own. She told me you'd said some really harsh things to her about being a burden." "I never said that." I said, "Not once, not in 3 years. I know that now." A lull pours. I feel sick, honestly. She's been in my guest room for 3 weeks telling me how hard it was living with you, and the whole time you were paying for her medication. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel guilty," I said finally. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I'm tired of being the person who lets things go uncorrected so everyone else can stay comfortable." "What do you want me to do?" Michelle asked. "I don't want you to do anything. I'm not asking you to kick her out or take a side against her. I just needed you to know the truth. She did this to me too, you know," Michelle said. "Growing up, told me things about you that weren't true so I'd stay loyal to her instead of you. I think that's just how she keeps people close. She makes sure you need her to be the reasonable one." My mother called me the following Friday. "Renee," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile, "I think we need to talk. Just the two of us. I think this has all gotten so blown out of proportion." "Which part," I asked, "has gotten blown out of proportion? The part where you told the family I refused to take care of you, or the part where I have 3 years of receipts proving I did?" A pause. "I never said you refused to take care of me. You said it wasn't your fault I wasn't wanted somewhere." I said, quoting the group text I now knew by heart. "You told Michelle it was simpler to let people believe I'd kicked you out. That's in writing, Mom. I have the screenshots." I was embarrassed. My mother finally said, "I didn't want people to know I'd been living in your basement for 3 years like some kind of charity case. I didn't want to be the pathetic one who couldn't take care of herself after Roger. It was easier to say it hadn't worked out between us than to say I'd needed you that much." "I understand that you were embarrassed," I said carefully. "I don't understand why my dignity was the thing you were willing to spend to protect yours." "What if we told everyone the truth now?" she said, brightening slightly. "I'll call Aunt Carol myself. I'll say I misspoke, that I was going through a hard time and I said some things I shouldn't have, and you and I can just move forward. I don't want this to be the thing between us forever, Renee. You're my daughter. I appreciate that you want to fix it," I said, "but I need you to understand something. I'm not angry that you needed help. I would have given you that basement for the rest of your life and never once brought up a dollar amount, if that's what you'd needed. What I can't get past is that the moment you didn't need me anymore, you wrote 3 years of my life into a story where I was the villain because it was easier than admitting you depended on someone you didn't respect." "That's not," she started. "I think you do respect competence, Mom. I think you respect what I do for people. I just don't think you've ever respected me the same way you'd respect a stranger who did the exact same things, because I was free, and free things don't get thanked the way expensive things do." She cried on the phone after that. Not performed tears, I don't think, but real ones. She apologized in a fuller way than she had before. "I forgive you," I told her. "I mean that. But I'm not doing this again, Mom. Not the basement, not the unspoken arrangement, where I give everything and you decide later how to describe it. If you ever need help again, real help, medical, financial, whatever it is, I will absolutely be there. But it's going to be on paper next time. An actual agreement with both our names on it, that neither of us gets to rewrite later depending on who's in the room. "You sound like your father," she said quietly. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just finally learned that being loved and being useful aren't the same contract." The months that followed didn't resolve into anything as tidy as a reconciliation montage. My mother stayed at Michelle's for another 4 months before she found a small one-bedroom apartment of her own, subsidized partly by her part-time hours at the fabric store and partly by a modest monthly contribution from me. But this time it existed on paper. I drafted it myself, a flat monthly amount, a start date and end date pending her Social Security adjustment, both our signatures at the bottom. She hated it at first. "This feels so cold," she said, "like I'm a tenant." "You're not a tenant," I said. "You're my mother, and I love you, and I'm still willing to help you. This just means neither of us gets to lie about what the help was later to someone else." She signed it. Michelle and I talk more now than we have in a decade, though I'd be lying if I said the reunion of our sisterhood was seamless. There is a particular kind of caution that settles between two people once one of them has watched the other be lied to and repeated it without checking. Not resentment, exactly, but a kind of careful re-earning of trust, a few degrees at a time. She calls before she repeats anything now. She asks me directly instead of asking around me. I think, in her own way, she learned something from the group chat too, something about what it costs to be the audience for a story you never verified. Patrick, characteristically, never fully engaged with any of it beyond his initial "holy shit, Renee." He sends a check now, twice a year, toward Mom's apartment, unprompted, which is more than he'd ever contributed in 3 years of my quietly funding a basement 3 states away from him. I don't know if that's guilt or growth. I've decided it doesn't matter which, as long as the check clears. And Carol, to her credit, has become one of the more thoughtful people in my extended family since that Sunday night. She calls me now sometimes, just to check in, not out of obligation, but because I think watching a story collapse in front of her taught her something about the danger of comfortable assumptions. We're not close, not the way I imagine some families are, but she is at minimum someone who asks before she believes now, and in my family, that has turned out to be a rarer quality than I ever expected it to be. As for my mother and me, we have dinner once every 2 weeks now at a restaurant, not my house, which was a boundary I set for myself and never fully explained to her, though I think she understands it anyway. My kitchen table has been the site of too many negotiations for me to want it to also be the site of ordinary family dinners for a while longer. Maybe that changes eventually. Maybe it doesn't. I'd stopped needing to know the ending in advance the way I used to need to know every number before I'd trust a room. She still, occasionally, tells a version of a story that softens her own role in it. I don't think that instinct will ever fully leave her, not at 64, not after a lifetime of believing that being seen as capable mattered more than being honest about needing help. But she doesn't tell those stories about me anymore. Not the basement, not the 3 years. Not to Aunt Carol, not to Michelle, not to anyone, because she knows now, in a way she didn't before that Sunday night, that I keep receipts and that I am, when it finally matters, entirely willing to use them. I think about that phrase often. She'd rather look calm than look right. Because for 38 years my mother was correct about me. I would rather have looked calm. I built an entire personality, an entire professional identity, around being the person who never needs to raise her voice because she's already done the work quietly in advance and let the numbers speak for her. I thought that made me strong. For a long time it also made me invisible in exactly the way that suited everyone around me best, a reliable, silent infrastructure that nobody had to thank, because nobody had to imagine it not being there. What I learned, sitting alone in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with a laptop full of 3 years of unthanked transfers, is that quiet and invisible are not the same thing, and that a person can spend a lifetime being generous without ever once being truly known, because the people receiving that generosity had simply never been asked to look closely enough to see her. I know now the difference between being needed and being loved. Being needed asks nothing of the person doing the needing except that they keep showing up. Being loved asks something harder, that the people who benefit from you actually see the cost of what you're giving and choose freely to be grateful for it rather than entitled to it. My basement is a home gym now. I go down there most mornings before work, and some mornings, running on the treadmill in the gray early light through that window, well, I think about the version of me who spent 3 years believing that paying quietly, without complaint, without ever once itemizing the cost out loud, was the truest form of love I had to offer. I don't think she was wrong to give. I think she was wrong to give without ever once asking to be seen for it. If you keep one thing from my story, let it be this. Love that requires your invisibility is not love. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure, no matter how well built, is never going to be thanked the way a person deserves to be. Not until the day it's finally allowed to speak plainly with its own name attached and say, "This is what I gave, and it was real, and I would like, finally, to be seen for it." That's my story. 3 years in a basement, one group text, and $71,340.16 that finally told the truth when I couldn't bring myself to raise my voice. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one who gives quietly and gets rewritten later by people who never once check the facts, take this as your permission to keep your own receipts, not out of bitterness, but because the truth deserves to survive contact with someone else's comfortable lie. If this story stayed with you, share it with a woman who's been someone's invisible infrastructure for too long. Drop a comment below. I read every one.